This webinar is going to provide an overview of trauma-informed care and how it can be applied across child and family service settings. The presentation is going to define trauma and trauma-informed care and discuss the specific steps to creating a trauma-informed approach. So to do that, we have a very special beloved guest we have brought back for this session, and that is Dr. Lisa Conradi. On the next slide, you'll learn a little bit more about Dr. Conradi, who is the president and founder of Trauma Informed Innovations, LLC, and the former executive director here at the Chadwick Center for Children and Families at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego. And over the past 20 years, Dr. Conradi has worked in the field of child trauma and in supporting service systems at the local and state level in their efforts to become more trauma-informed. She has authored and co-authored a variety of publications on trauma screening and assessment practices, creating trauma-informed systems, and presenting nationally on innovative practices designed to improve the service delivery system for children who have experienced trauma. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with training in multiple evidence-based trauma-focused treatment practices. She is on the editorial board for the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma, and a frequent reviewer for the Journal of Child and Family Studies and Child Welfare Journal. She is co-author of the recent book, Trauma-Informed Assessment with Children and Adolescents, Strategies to Support Clinicians. And with that, we want to say good morning, Dr. Conradi. It's so wonderful to see you again, and we're looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Haley, and thank you to the entire Caltrin team. It is my honor and privilege to be here talking with all of you today to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care. One of the things that I had asked as part of the pre-assessment was to get a sense of how many of you have participated in trauma-informed care trainings. And it was a real interesting distribution. So for some of you, this might be your very first training on trauma-informed care. And if that's you, I am excited to welcome you to a topic that I am very, very passionate about. You've likely heard the terminology and the language out in the lexicon. For some of you, you maybe have been to several trainings. You've been to 10 or more trauma-informed care trainings. So for those of you who've been to so many trainings, thank you for coming to yet another trauma-informed care training. And I hope that this gives you maybe a little bit of information in a different way to help. Maybe, I know it takes 7 times to hear something, so maybe it'll help get some ideas going for you. And then for those of you who are kind of in the middle of that curve, welcome, and I'm glad you're here and glad to be spending the next hour and a half with you today. So what we're going to talk about is, first, we're going to talk about, SAMHSA has these 4 key assumptions of a trauma-informed approach. It's very baseline information on what it means to be trauma-informed. We're also going to talk about the 4 steps, the way I think about it, in creating a trauma-informed agency. We're going to talk about at least 3 ways that you can help promote psychological safety at your agency in your specific role. Because again, this is designed for folks, whether you are a frontline worker, whether you are a leader. It's really designed for anybody in your role on how you can make your agency and organization more trauma-informed. And finally, you will hopefully be able to identify 3 specific things that you can do in your role, because we all play a part in creating trauma-informed environments. So we're going to start today with a poll. So the first poll we have is, what type of organization and or system do you represent? So looks like Haley just put that up. We see a lot of child welfare coming through. I've done a lot of work in supporting child welfare systems to be more trauma-informed, so that's very near and dear to my heart. We see some mental health. If you represent a different kind of organization that's not indicated there, feel free to put that in the chat. We see Wraparound, First 5, TBS, a Children's Advocacy Center, which is what we are at the Chadwick Center, Relief Nursery, we have FRCs, more First 5s, nonprofit and community education, family partners, HFA. Wonderful. Oh, a lot of CACs. It's wonderful to see our partners out there. Human Response Network. So a lot of great different discipline or types of organizations represented. So wonderful. So we will go ahead and share the results. We got those. So yeah, a nice diverse group. So the next slide or poll that we have is asking you about your role. So whether that's an organizational leader, supervisor, frontline staff, and if that isn't, if none of these options represent you, you can go ahead and type that into the chat as well. So we just get a sense of who we have on today. We've got our content specialist. Hi, Jennifer. Community navigator, advocacy, wonderful. Got a little bit of leaders on there too. If you're a leader, we have the Trauma Informed Leadership in 2 weeks that Jess mentioned that I'll be doing. It's another area that I'm very passionate about. Family support specialist, developmental specialist, trauma therapist. Hi, Gladys, nice to see you. Care coordinator. It's great. So a lot of mostly frontline staff, some supervisors, and some organizational leaders. So this is great. We can go ahead and we'll move on. Oh, social worker, so business psychologist. Well, that's fun. Great. Okay, perfect. So now that we have a sense of who is on the call today, we're going to go ahead and dive in. So I like to set the stage by talking about trauma and providing a definition. And as a reminder, Haley put the participant guide back in the chat. You see the number 2. So if you have that, you can open up that participant guide. You can go to page 2 and you can follow along there. But when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about these significant events, and either a single event or a series of events or sets of circumstances that is an individual experiences that is emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects. So it impacts an individual's functioning in the mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. When I'm talking about trauma, I'm not talking about stressful events that we recover from within a reasonable period of time. We are talking about the kinds of events that fundamentally impact how you see and relate to the world at a very core level and are likely to have a long-lasting impact. So sometimes particularly lately, I've really heard the term trauma used. If you get on social media like I do and you follow things related to trauma, you see the word trauma kind of everywhere to describe any sort of stressful experience. And that's not really, when we look at the literature on trauma, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these kind of fundamental things that impact us on such a core, deep level that it impacts how we relate and function in the world and the relationships that we have with those around us. So with that definition in mind, feel free to put in the chat, any experiences that might be considered traumatic. So removals, sexual abuse, car accident, great, divorce. And I would say sometimes divorce is traumatic, sometimes it's not. Those high conflict ones can definitely be traumatic. Domestic violence, loss of a loved one, placement in foster care, we see domestic violence. COVID-19 definitely was experienced as traumatic by a lot of folks. Homelessness, natural disasters, emotional abuse, police brutality. What a great example. Thank you for bringing that up, Annabelle. Genocide. So there's a lot of events that folks experience in the world, whether that's out in our community or within our homes, that are really considered traumatic. So see, being bullied. So a lot of these significant experiences, and the numbers for trauma are incredibly high. We know that at least 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, depending on what statistics you're looking at, of individuals before the age of 18 experience some kind of life-threatening trauma. So that means that a lot of who we are personally, as well as the clients we serve, especially if you're in a trauma-specific organization, you are running into clients and serving them, and they've experienced these kinds of events that profoundly impact how they see and relate to the world. And that's why being trauma-informed is so important. So when we talk about trauma-informed care understands and considers the pervasive nature of trauma. So trauma being everywhere, like I said, and promotes environments of healing and recovery rather than practices and services that may inadvertently re-traumatize. So what does this actually really mean? So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which many of you are likely familiar with and may even have funding from, have really taken the lead at the federal level on thinking about what it means to have a trauma-informed approach. And they've been doing this work for the last 15 years. So they have identified what they call the 4 R's. And so we're going to walk through those 4 R's because that really is what I see as kind of the baseline of knowledge that we need to understand in order to be trauma informed. So the first R is what they call realization. So all people at all levels of the organization or system have a basic realization about trauma and understand how trauma can affect families, groups, organizations, and communities, as well as individuals. So we understand that this is there, and we have the training to understand how it also impacts our families. People in the organization or system can recognize the signs of trauma. So not only do you know that it's there, but you recognize the signs of it. I will tell you that this sounds a lot easier than it is, because one of the things about trauma and how it shows up is it shows up in ways we don't always understand. It's not a neat little list. Our screening measures don't, and I'm a big fan of trauma screening, our screening measures don't always capture the complexity and nuance of what it looks like for an individual who has experienced trauma. The third R is the program or organization or system responds. Oh, I just saw Daisy put in trauma is never linear. Thank you, Daisy. I love that. The program, organization, or system responds by applying the principles of a trauma-informed approach to all areas of functioning. So this is the action item. You don't just know that trauma exists, but the organization or system or person is actually doing something to help mitigate the impact. And finally, we seek to resist re-traumatization of clients as well as staff. So when we first started this conversation about trauma-informed care, back in 2001 really is where it started coming from. The conversation was so much about the clients that we serve and why it's so important to have a trauma-informed approach when we're working in organizations, because we understand that our clients and families have experienced trauma and that affects how they see the world, as I've said. But one of the things I really want to highlight is that we are also part of this as the workforce. The reality is a lot of folks come into this work because you've had your own experience and you want to give back. You've had a healing experience, you want to give back. And so being trauma informed for you as part of the workforce is just as important, if not more important, than it is in serving our families. Because often when we don't have that experience in the organization ourselves, it is really hard to provide that experience for the families that we serve. So this is about the whole system. So I loved this. Trauma Informed Oregon has done a lot of work in this space, and they've put together this great kind of visual representation of really thinking about the foundation of trauma-informed care. So, as they say, trauma-informed care recognizes that traumatic experiences terrify, overwhelm, and violate the individual. And trauma-informed care itself is a commitment not to repeat these experiences in whatever way possible to restore a sense of safety, power, and worth. So they think of the foundation as a commitment to awareness. So we saw that in the 4 R's. And they also add a piece about understanding the impact of historical trauma and oppression. And there is no world in which we can talk about trauma-informed care without talking about the impact of historical trauma, racial justice, and oppression. So agencies that demonstrate trauma-informed care with policies, procedures, and practices that first create a safe context through physical safety, creating trustworthiness, clear and consistent boundaries, transparency, predictability, and choice. They also restore power through choice empowerment using a strengths perspective and skill building. And finally, build self-worth through relationship, respect, compassion, acceptance and non-judgment, mutuality, and collaboration. So when SAMHSA really started articulating the 4 R's of a trauma-informed approach, they developed these kind of 6 principles. And so we're going to just briefly go over these principles. The first is safety. So when they're talking about safety, they're talking about both physical and psychological safety, which I'm guessing is language that you've heard a lot. It's very popular in the public lexicon. Developing trust and transparency. So being honest with clients about what you can do and not do. Peer support. So individuals have shared experiences being involved in providing the services, people feeling like they're not alone in the services that they're receiving. Collaboration and mutuality. We are all in this together. We're working together to support families, and we all have a voice. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So really making sure that we're not telling folks what they need to do, but they really have a voice in what happens for them, as well as talking about cultural, historical, and gender issues. So there's a lot of benefits to a trauma-informed approach. National Council for Behavioral Health has put this together. This is a little older, but this still stands. One is it really creates a proactive approach to physical and emotional safety for clients, families, and staff. Before we had the language about trauma-informed care, we weren't talking about psychological safety in the same way we are now. Now, I would say that there's a lot of complexity in psychological safety that might get a little bit lost when we talk about it, but generally, the language of safety is so important, and it's almost impossible to create safety without thinking about an individual's broader levels of experience. And so safety is critical. Creating and sustaining opportunities for choice, power, and control through increased therapeutic interactions. So we know that the loss of power, trauma is characterized by a loss of power and control over an individual's experience. So providing opportunities to reclaim some of that power and control is critical. It also decreases the stigma related to trauma and mental health concerns. I'm thrilled that we really have, if you compare today to when I started doing this work, 16, 17 years ago, thinking about trauma-informed care, we have a completely different public awareness about trauma and mental health in ways we couldn't even have imagined 15, 20 years ago. So we really have done a lot of work to decrease stigma. We're not fully there yet, but there's been a lot of great work that's happened. And again, I wanted to note, you can look at page 5 of your participant workbook to follow along. It also helps reduce the possibility of re-traumatization. If we understand what trauma is and what causes trauma, we can also try to prevent re-traumatization when families are accessing our services. Improving the social environment in a way that improves all relationships. One of the things that Bessel van der Kolk says is that complex trauma occurs within the context of relationships and heals within the context of relationships. So relationships and the benefits of relationships are so critical when we're dealing with trauma. I would say it's probably the #1 thing. Therapy is great. All the other kinds of services we provide are incredibly helpful, but positive healing relationships is the core to any kind of trauma healing. Another benefit of a trauma-informed approach is creating environments that care for and support staff. So again, we're all part of this as well. We increase the quality of services, reducing unnecessary interventions and reducing costs, reducing the number and types of negative encounters. So back when I was in training as a psychologist, I worked at an inpatient hospital, and we routinely used seclusion and restraint. So I'm aging myself a little bit there. That's not something that's accepted anymore in the same way. It was used daily. There'd be kids in seclusion and restraints when I was in that experience. So we know that that's not actually a healing practice. Creating a resilience and strengths-based focus, increasing family and client satisfaction, and increasing success and job satisfaction among staff. Turns out that we, as members of the workforce, resonate with a trauma-informed approach as well, which is why I'm guessing you guys came to this training, whether it's your first training or your 15th training on trauma-informed care. So the way I think about it is there's really kind of 4 steps to creating a trauma-informed agency. So we're going to walk through each of these steps. It starts with really creating this culture change at an organizational level. You have to start big. And so for those of you who are senior leaders on this call, I'm talking to you. Next is really setting that baseline for safety, addressing secondary traumatic stress at the individual and organizational level, and finally, identifying those tasks that you can implement within your organizational scope. So step 1, creating culture shift at the organizational level. So what is organizational culture? So organizational culture is kind of one of those things that has a definition, but you kind of know it when you see it too. So Cook and Rousseau define it as implicit norms, values, and shared behavioral expectations and assumptions of an organization. So basically, this is how we do things here. It's shaped by several forces, including leaders. And when we talk about leaders, we're talking about both those formal leaders, so those leaders, supervisors, managers, those folks on this call who fit that official role, as well as informal leaders. I think we can all reflect on who we work with, and there are individuals who may not serve an actual official leadership role, but they absolutely affect the culture. They have this informal leadership. People look to them for the tone of the organization. And if that person is positive and has a great tone, that's fantastic. If they're negative, if they're frustrated, if they're burnt out, and people start listening to that, that can adversely affect your organization as well. So this is one of my favorite videos about organizational culture. So I'm going to play this for you now.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are 2 people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's nothing else left to do, is there?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he could fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
Life is good when I see the sunlight in the morning.
So I love this video because it really reminds us about how we really can get stuck in a culture and in a specific way of thinking, and not until we take a step back do we really think about the culture in a different way. Are we able to be more creative in how we address problems? Because as we're watching this, we're kind of snickering, going, wait, they're on an escalator. All they need to do is take a step up, right? And so sometimes we can get so stuck in our existing culture that we forget some of the innovative solutions and ways that we can address change. But that's really what it takes to create a trauma-informed organization, is reflecting on how we can change our culture in a different way. So in order to change culture, though, we have to have organizational readiness. The Resilience Institute has defined organizational readiness as a resilient organization is able to adapt and thrive in times of uncertainty, pressure, and ambiguity. Succeeding as an organization is much more likely when we build resilience into our strategy, culture, and day-to-day practices. A resilient organization enables individual resilience. So in order for us to really be able to take on these changes, we have to be an organization that understands that change is a part of what we do, and that we're able to be flexible and be more innovative and thoughtful. So how do we create a culture shift? So culture shifts happen, and again, you can look at your participant guide on page 7 to get more information on this. But really, it involves all aspects of program activities, setting, relationships. There's a lot of research on in the implementation science world about the kinds of settings and changes that need to happen in order for us to truly create a culture shift. It's not something that happens with a train and pray model. So if this is the best training, if you are the most motivated that you've ever been, and you go back to your organization, even if you're the most motivated, you're not going to be able to create this change right away. It has to be something that happens on a pretty large level. It also involves all groups, administrators, supervisors, direct service staff, and consumers or families, more than service providers. And really, I actually find this to be empowering, because we all play a role in creating that culture shift, which is why I titled this training the way that I did, is understanding your role in creating a trauma-informed environment, because we all play a part in that. It also involves making trauma-informed change into a new routine, new way of thinking and acting, more than new information. And so this is something that doesn't just happen because we went to a training. It's not something that just happens once. There's a part of who we are and how we think and respond to situations that is critical to creating a trauma-informed organizational culture. So let's see. Oh, I think I skipped. Here we go. So shifting your perspective from what is wrong with our agency, the agency, organization, system, to what is happening, has happened for our system, what gets us through. One of my favorite quotes is, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So when we think about how the system runs, it runs that way for a reason, whether we agree with it or not. We get the kinds of results based on how the system is set up. In order to change the system, we have to change the whole thing. We can't just change one part of it. So what are some of the kind of barricades or and bridges for compliance versus culture change? Because often what happens when we're trying to change cultures is we actually focus on compliance. We focus on this kind of checkbox approach. So what it can look like is train and pray, which I mentioned, a checkbox approach, and practice change without people change, which means you're requiring people to do things a little differently, but they're not actually invested in those changes. They get frustrated, and they may not actually mean them. So they're checking all the boxes, but you might not actually see a big change in your culture. So how do we deal with this? Leaders have to play a critical role in this. So when they say 4 times, leaders have to put in kind of 4 times the work up front in order for this kind of culture change to happen. It requires digging in, getting in there over and over and over again. Prioritizing people over products. We understand that you're a business and you have to meet business need, you have to serve families, but we have to make sure our staff are supported as well. We provide education on culture change. So I was on a phone call last week talking with somebody who was a little challenged and frustrated with her culture, and but some good things had happened, some leadership changes had happened. She was feeling really positive, but the reality check is that her culture isn't going to change overnight just because there's some new staff members, that there's a whole process that needs to happen, and that her culture was probably not going to change for another 6 to 12 months as it moves through this process. That's, if you think about it that way, instead of it has to change yesterday, then you have a more realistic expectation, and it feels a little bit more doable. Another one of my favorite quotes is go slow to go fast. We have to put in the time up front, and that can feel frustrating to people because they want to see the change right away, but change takes time. It also requires transparent communication, really being honest about what's going on. Now, depending on your role, that communication might look different. If you're a senior leader, you may not be able to share all of the information that is coming down to you because things might be changing all the time. There might be some issues with confidentiality regarding certain staff members or certain policy issues or procedures or something. So really thinking about, if you're a senior leader, transparent communication at the 50,000 foot level. If you're a supervisor, transparent communication at the 20,000 foot level. And then if you're a frontline practitioner, really having ongoing transparent communication based on the information you know at that time. So strategies to create organizational culture change. One of those is to incorporate use of implementation science principles. I mentioned the constructs. That's something called CFIR. Greg Ahrens developed the EPIS model, which is a great model of implementation within settings, how you implement change. If you're interested in that, I highly, highly recommend that you check out that model. Other things to do is training. I know you can't train and pray, I've said that, but it does provide a lovely baseline of what we're expecting, what things can look like. Training is really where you start. It's not where you end, but it's where you start. Also integrating the use of champions during the rollout process. So if you're looking at rolling out trauma-informed care, having a couple of folks who at every meeting, they're the ones who have the crown of trauma-informed. Actually, we worked with a county once that the trauma-informed champion wore a trauma tiara, and their job was in the meeting to bring trauma-informed language, thinking, perspective into every interaction, and they wore the tiara, and that's how they did it. Using organizational culture assessments, integrating a train the trainer approach, so really embedding within the organization so you don't have to always go outside for that. Don't pretend it will be easy. Identify barriers up front and throughout the process, as well as strategies to overcome them. And if you have other strategies that you've come across that help shift organizational culture, type those in the chat. So I see Caitlin, change is not an event, it's a process. I love that. So feel free to keep putting your ideas on organizational culture change in the chat. So step 2 is creating a safe environment for staff and clients. So I already talked a little bit about safety, so we're going to set the stage a little bit more for this. So Sandy Bloom and Brian Farragher are really the ones who came up with this concept within the trauma-informed care literature on physical and psychological safety. So they define physical safety as freedom from threats of violence, whether that's from self or others. Physical safety involves being aware of risks in the environment and taking steps to ensure basic physical safety when there is a threat. Psychological safety, on the other hand, also known as emotional safety, is the ability to be safe within one's own identity and sense of feeling safe with other people in one's community. Your ability to create psychological safety may increase comfort for that person to also feel psychologically safe. One of the caveats I want to say here is sometimes I've heard the language of psychological safety when somebody's unhappy about a decision. So as a leader, somebody would come and say, we don't feel safe. Here's why. And I think that's an important conversation to have, listen, but sometimes it's disagreeing. And the ability to come to the table and say, I don't like this, is actually a sign of psychological safety. We want to be able to have conversations where we disagree, either within teams, across teams, with our clients. Our clients should be able to say that to us. That's actually a sign of psychological safety. So psychological safety does not equal happiness. It equals a comfort to share your perspective in a place where it is well open and received and can start a dialogue. I see Jillian has put in the chat, we have implemented different trainings and strategies with all staff, but I believe protective factors training has been successful in providing trauma-informed care. That's such a great point. Thank you, Jillian. So one of the things I wanted to highlight about psychological safety is that it doesn't mean that there's no conflict. And there's actually some great literature that there's kind of two different kinds of conflict in the workplace or when we're doing this work, right? So there's relational conflict. So that means I have a challenge with this other person. And then there's process conflict, which means we disagree on how this kind of service should be provided. Organizations can and should have a good amount of process conflict. So we don't agree on how things should happen. So we need to have a lot of conversations, and sometimes they might be a little bit tense on how things should happen. We run into trouble when we bump into relational conflict. And sometimes what can happen is we disagree on the process so much that we then decide we have an issue with because of that person. Once it becomes about person versus person, that's the kind of conflict where we need real support, because it's very hard to feel safe in an environment when you feel like somebody doesn't, kind of personal, has something personal against you, or you have something personal against somebody else. So trying to keep conflict and discussions at the process level versus about the person is critical for creating psychological safety in the workplace. So the role of safety in trauma and adversity, hopefully this is nothing new to everybody. Individuals who've experienced trauma have had their fundamental safety taken away from them. It's either their own safety or that for the people that they love. So they have very valid fears about their own sense of safety, which can then lead to difficulty in trusting others to protect them. And then they go through being hyper aware of potential threats. An interesting research that's come out that I don't think it's going to be a surprise, is that when there's a traumatic event, it accesses a certain part of your brain. When later on, when you have a trigger about that event, it accesses that same part of the brain. So it really is your brain, when you're triggered for an event, your brain is experiencing it as though it's experiencing the actual event. So even if that reminder of the fireworks that reminds you of the gunshot, let's say, that's a very obvious trigger. So that can be, that's experienced in the same way. So part of what happens for our families and for us in the workforce is that we could actually be triggered by something that we haven't differentiated, we haven't necessarily dealt with this, or it's something that's coming up with for us or for our clients. And that leads to this hyper awareness of potential threats. I see Daisy, sometimes our bodies remind us before our minds do. I would say often our bodies remind us before our minds do. Thank you, Daisy. I love that point. And then that can lead to problems controlling their reactions for perceived threats, right? And so again, our body responds before our minds do. And to your point, Daisy, when we have an emotional response, it happens in the one part of our brain. And when we have a cognitive, planning, thoughtful response, it happens in another part of our brain. Those parts of the brain cannot be active at the same time, right? So your frontal lobe and your limbic system are not active at the same time. So you are either in the emotional brain or you are in your cognitive brain. And part of what we think about when we're trying to create trauma-informed environments, when folks are really in the emotional part of their brain a lot, is how do we help get to the cognitive part of our brain? Because you'll even see this in organizations. I've worked in organizations like this where we're constantly reactive. That's emotional part of your brain. You're constantly being reactive. You don't get to be planful. You don't get to be innovative when you constantly have to react. So as an individual, as an organization, being able to step away from that emotional part of your brain and moving into the cognitive part of your brain is critical. And we can only do that by having support, by knowledge that this is what's happening. I'll tell you, this is what I do for a living. Oh, thank you. We see Bessel van der Kolk's book, Body Keeps the Score, is a great example of all of this. So I highly recommend it. But part of what we need to do as organizations, as individuals, is think about how we can make those transitions ourselves. And this is what I do for a living, and sometimes I get stuck in it. So it's an ongoing process. So trauma reminders, we've already kind of talked about this. When faced with people, situations, or places, individuals may re-experience the intense and disturbing feelings, and they can lead to behaviors that might just seem completely out of place in the current situation, but were appropriate at the time of the event. So the next video I'm going to share is actually what I think of as a way, it's a strategy we can use to get out of our emotional brain and into our cognitive brain. That when somebody comes with us and they've experienced pain or suffering, when we go towards sympathy, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, right? That's a more activated response. We want their discomfort to go away when we're thinking that. Empathy is a completely different response. So I'll share this video and hopefully, I find it very helpful. So.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I love that video because I want to take some of the language that has come up there. So she talks about connection, right? And when we are in our emotional brain, it is very hard to be connected, right? We're usually trying to protect ourselves. And that's where the silver lining comes in. Like, oh, I can't take this on right now. I'm having a response to this. I don't want to, for some reason, I need to feel separate from this. So as we are providers supporting families, thinking about the space that we are in when we are providing that kind of support, or if you're a leader supporting your staff, if your first response is, oh, I just want this to stop. Oh, I just want this person I'm having this like response. I keep giving them suggestions and they're not following through, or whatever it might be in your role. That's a limbic response. That because we actually probably feel helpless. We feel like we can't actually be there for them, and they know it. And that can actually create this dynamic between us and them. So when I talk about being trauma informed, I'm talking about practices, but I'm also talking about our own awareness and ability to be present in the moment and connect in a way that maybe we haven't done before because we've been checking our boxes, or we are overwhelmed, or we're in reactive mode, or there's not enough capacity, right? I've worked in nonprofits my whole career. There's never enough capacity. I know what that's like, right? So what I would argue to all of you there is that to be trauma informed, we need to really be able to take that step back and have an awareness of ourselves and the space that we're coming from. In order to be in the space that Brene Brown is talking about in that video, it can't be that emotional space. It has to be a space where we're putting it in between us, and it is more of that thoughtful, cognitive brain, right? So helping move in that direction. So here's some concrete ways to promote safety, but I would also say having that safety within ourselves and being able to show up and be connected and relational is going to help promote safety as much as any of these concrete suggestions. So one is share as much information about what will happen as possible. So being transparent, being upfront, don't make promises that you can't keep or things that you don't know about, but actually be upfront about it. Two, provide as many opportunities as possible for the client to have control over the situation. So one of the hallmarks of trauma is losing control, having control taken away from you in a situation. So even if, let's say you work in a system where the client has to do X, Y, and Z, what are the options for them to have control over A, B, and C, right? I'm a trauma therapist by training. Some of you might be trauma therapists as well. I'm a big fan of assessment. One of the things, maybe they have to complete the assessment, but they get a choice in the order of how they complete the assessment or what pen or pencil that they use to complete the assessment, right? So even if it's these micro things, all you parents out there probably use the same thing, same kind of strategies with your kids, right? They have to eat dinner, but these are the choices that they have there, right? So making sure, and not to liken our clients to children, but the way in which we support and provide them with control can be very similar and is really important. Three is being transparent regarding decisions and outcomes. That comes back to being transparent in the way that is appropriate, given your role, given the scenario. Actively integrate the client into discussions about what could happen that will help them feel safe. Be very clear with next steps, sharing information in multiple ways. Here's the thing, when clients come in to access our services, they are probably all emotional, right? This is a scary, scary situation for them. And then we give them a list of things that they need to do. And then we get frustrated if they don't follow that list. I want you to think about a time where, let's say you were a loved one was in a hospital and the doctor comes in and starts spouting out things, or you're going in for a doctor's appointment. You know, I've gone in with parents for important doctor's appointments where so much information comes out, you hear all of this stuff and you're overwhelmed. You're not able to take it all in. So providing information in multiple ways is critical, and understanding that they're not going to be able to take it all in. They need that support. Number 5, be very clear with the next steps. Actually, that's what I said. And number 6, assess your environment for physical and emotional safety. There's some agency self-assessments. You can actually just Google trauma-informed agency assessment, and you'll see a bunch of things. Harris and Follett have one, creating cultures of trauma-informed care. It's an assessment that you can do. There's also the trauma-informed organizational assessment developed through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. But this really helps you get some strategies in place to create that environment. Are there other strategies that you have used to promote safety within your organizations? Feel free to type those in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and go on, but I will come back and take a look at some of the things that come up. And a reminder again about the workbook, we're on page 8. Step 3 is addressing secondary traumatic stress at the individual and organizational level. When we first started talking about secondary traumatic stress, 15 years ago, often it was this addendum. It was the last step in how we implement things at our agency. It was kind of the thing that came at the end. What I would argue is that you've got to do the culture, you've got to create that baseline of safety, and then you have to address secondary traumatic stress and understand that it is likely to happen within our organizations. When you are working with trauma, often folks who do this work come to this work because they feel like they have a particular set of understanding, skills, sensitivity. We feel like there's something special about us that equips us to be able to do this work. That means we are also more vulnerable to the impact of secondary traumatic stress. It is more normative. If you are somebody who secondary traumatic stress never happens to, chances are you didn't get into work of helping families at their most vulnerable. Those things just don't tend to coexist. So what I like to tell individuals and organizations is that this is something that you need to invite in the room and understand and put in place strategies at both the individual and organizational level. So when we talk about individual strategies, these really are those that focus on the impact that the work has on providers and the need for this work. So this includes the provider managing the work itself. So working with the individual staff member. So that might be for you as an individual. This is not the organization. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So identifying areas that bring energy. So resources to help providers identify areas in their work that create burnout and tools to address it in the moment. So when we first started talking about secondary traumatic stress, a lot of the language was on self-care. I remember some of the first trainings I went to on secondary trauma back in 2007. These were great trainings and the field always evolves, but the training might have been focused on bringing in somebody to facilitate an art project. I will tell you, I don't like arts and crafts. That's not something that brings me joy. That might be something that brings you joy. That might help you feel a little bit more balanced. It might be something you love to do. For me, it creates a lot of anxiety. So this would happen and it's like, this doesn't really work for me. So part of self-care, which is only part of the individual strategies, but part of self-care is really figuring out what it is for you. It might be yoga, meditation, all the things that we talk about. That happens to be what it is for me. But maybe for you, it's something completely different. Maybe it's going for a run. Maybe it's going out with friends. Maybe it's whatever it happens to be. So being aware of those self-care strategies. The next is really thinking about, there's this model called the CSERT model developed by Brian Miller. Some of you might be aware or have had training with Brian Miller on this. But one of the things that he talks about in his model is that for many of us, we get joy in the work. It's not like he doesn't assume that you work 5 days a week and then you have 2 days on the weekend where you're expected to recover from those 5 days. What he argues is the importance of embedding throughout your day, throughout your job, the things that bring you joy. Understanding that we all have things that bring us energy and we all have things that deplete our energy. So how can you balance your particular role, your particular job, to have things that bring you energy? And that might be, our clinical director at Chadwick loves Excel spreadsheets, loves getting in, couldn't be more excited when she gets to dig into data in Excel. That's just a part of her job, but that's something that brings her joy. Making sure that's a part of what she gets to do, right? So how do we embed that in our work and balance those things together? And then the third strategy, which I saw Jillian put something in the chat, and that really is part of it, is We use this reflective supervision model. So our team sees a therapist contracted through our organization to support our needs and help us to reflect and work through secondary trauma. So if you can do that, having somebody that you can actually work through and address some of the secondary trauma, they see her weekly or monthly. So having that specific intervention can be incredibly helpful as well. So that's what's on the individual. But individual strategies are not enough to address secondary traumatic stress. And for a long time, we always, as organizations, said it's on the person. The person needs to figure out how to manage this. Not anymore. Organizations need to take this very seriously. They need to validate the experience of their staff. They need to normalize that this is going to happen because of the kind of work that is done. So organizational strategies emphasize that organizations have the responsibility in creating a culture and climate that supports health and wellness, and that burnout occurs due to both the impact of the work and from organizational challenges. In my experience, we've done like assessments of organizational culture, and sometimes the work is what, a particular client can absolutely be what creates some secondary traumatic stress. But sometimes burnout is far bigger. So burnout is something that happens across organizations. It's not something that just happens within trauma-focused child and family serving systems, right? And so the burnout can be, I have a heck of a time accessing certain things on the computer, right? If you're remote employees and you have a hard time logging in, oh my gosh, takes so much of my time. Or this particular piece of equipment is not working for me, or whatever. We don't feel safe because our organization doesn't have a succession plan in place, that we don't feel like there's a good infrastructure, that we don't feel like things are equitable. So organizational strategies extend far beyond secondary traumatic stress. They include setting up an infrastructure that provides support for staff, but it also includes things of just looking at our general organizational culture and making sure that it's one that it provides support, has a good infrastructure that meets the needs of staff members on a more macro level. And both of these things have to be in play for this to really work. So organizational resiliencies that we found. So a sense of humor. I will tell you the things that we laugh at in the world of child abuse. If somebody were to walk in and hear that, they would be like horrified. But it's, the old saying, if you can't laugh, you'll cry. It's okay to have humor. Just make sure no clients can hear you, but to have a space where you get to just blow off a little steam, and that can be remarkable, right? Celebrations and joy, right? So making sure that there's space to acknowledge big wins. Reflection spaces and rituals. Reflection, this is what meditation, yoga, reflection does, is it takes us from our emotional brain to our cognitive brain. It's a very quick, taking 5 minutes to be mindful takes you from your emotional brain to your cognitive brain very quickly. So having spaces to do that is critical. Leadership commitment. Remember I said, ×4. Leaders have to get in there and dig in and make this a priority over and over again. And that can be hard on leaders. And that's what we're going to talk about. If you're a leader, come to Trauma-Informed Leadership. That can be hard work too. So we want space for you guys to be able to do this too. Capacity to adapt to a changing environment. Change is the only constant. As much as we like things to stay the same when they're good, it doesn't work out that way. I've never worked for an organization that doesn't go through changes on an ongoing basis. That's what we do. We also have to prioritize employee well-being, as we've said. Succession planning, that actually creates a great sense of safety, because we know there's a plan if there's something unexpected that happens among our leaders, for example. Staff diversity is celebrated. Critical, and then staff commitment to the organization's mission. So if you're interested in this kind of individual organizational strategy for addressing secondary traumatic stress, there is a tool. So I'm going to show you a little video. It's called the Secondary Traumatic Stress assessment, STS IOA. I'm blanking on the IO part, but you can look it up. If you look at page 15 of your participant guide, there is a link to this video. It was developed out of the University of Kentucky. We're going to talk about it, but it really talks about how to address secondary traumatic stress from more of an organizational perspective. So part of what you might be able to do as an individual is bring this resource to your leader, or if you're a leader, think about implementing this within your organization.
Indirect exposure to trauma is an occupational hazard for those working with individuals who have experienced trauma, including health and mental health professionals, child welfare workers, and first responders. Exposure to other people's trauma can cause intrusive thoughts, a rehashing of traumatic stories, distorted thinking, and mood changes. Together, these symptoms are called secondary traumatic stress, affecting 15 to 50% of workers. STS risk factors include how much trauma a worker is exposed to, the type of work they do, their risk factors, and life experiences. STS can lead to significant distress and even post-traumatic stress disorder, a serious condition. To guard against STS, workers who are exposed indirectly to trauma must do what they can to take care of themselves. But self-care isn't enough, and there will always be an elephant in the room. That is, what's going on in the organization. When exposure is high and stress isn't managed properly, it not only hurts the individual, but also creates pressure on the organization. Effects can include high levels of staff turnover, low levels of productivity, low job satisfaction, and absenteeism. To protect against this, organizations need to protect and care for their workforce. But until recently, it hasn't been clear on just what organizations need to do to reduce STS among staff. Dr. Ginny Sprang and colleagues developed the Secondary Traumatic Stress-Informed Organizational Assessment to guide employers through the process. In collaboration with Dr. Sprang's Secondary Traumatic Stress Lab at the University of Kentucky Center on Trauma and Children, the STS-IOA is being used all over the world to create trauma-responsive and secondary traumatic stress-informed organizations. The Secondary Traumatic Stress-Informed Organizational Assessment measures workplace stress in a way that's comprehensive, nuanced, and data-informed. This revolutionary tool uses structured questions to determine how STS-informed an organization is and how well they address secondary traumatic stress. This is an essential goal for becoming trauma-informed. Everyone in the organization has the opportunity to give feedback on how STS is managed and what changes should occur. These recommendations drive the ongoing work of the organization through learning collaboratives that structure the change. Using dashboards and color coding, the tool visually flags any urgent considerations that require prioritization and highlights the organization's strengths. The tool is used to develop a blueprint for intervention and to track improvements in managing STS levels, so strategies are data-driven. The outcome of projects driven by the Secondary Traumatic Stress-Informed Organizational Assessment is to keep workers well so they can better help people affected by trauma, and to increase organizational resilience, which benefits management, workers, and those they serve. For more information on how to use these tools to become STS-informed, visit this website, www.uky.edu/CTAC.
That's one great resource that you can use. I invite, if you've used other things to address secondary traumatic stress at the individual organizational level at your either personally or organizationally, feel free to put those in the chat. So finally, we're going to talk about specific tasks that you can implement within your organizational scope. As we learned at the beginning, we have folks on this webinar who have might be frontline staff members, we have supervisors, managers, and senior leaders. So what it looks like for you might be different. So here's kind of one way of thinking about these specific tasks. There's 6 trauma-informed core principles. So we're going to actually walk through each of these. The first is understanding trauma and stress. So really, it's education, starting with that baseline of education. We've talked about this before, making sure that we personally and our staff understand that trauma is common, but experienced uniquely due to its many variations, its complexity. We understand that stress, there's kind of optimal levels of positive stress that can be healthy, but then chronic and extreme stress can have damaging effects. We understand trauma reactions, so that these are adaptive. They make sense in the moment, but they may not make sense later on. And they can actually impede recovery and wellness. And finally, we understand that trauma can be overcome effectively through accessible treatments. We have treatments that work. Trauma can feel so overwhelming. One of the things that I like to say is that the goal of trauma treatment is to make the events part of who you are, not the defining characteristic. You're never going to forget or have it not be a part of your life, but it really is a part of who you are, not something that is always creeping around every corner, and impacting how you interact and relate to the world and the people you love. So how do we do that in action? So at the individual level, you personally attending webinars like this and Trauma 101 webinars, reading books like Bessel van der Kolk's book is a great example, sharing your knowledge with others, understanding your own experiences of trauma. We are part of this. You cannot show up without your own awareness. If you decide you're going to put that in a box and it's not going to come out, you're not going to be able to show up. You're actually going to be more reactive. It's one of those things you got to go through in order to be able to truly connect and do this work and really be trauma informed instead of just talking about it. Organizationally, those leaders out there provide trainings on trauma resilience and recovery, provide informational materials for your clients, posters, reading on the impacts of trauma and stress that's readily available. The next is compassion and dependability. So the core competencies for increasing compassion and dependability. We strive to act compassionately across our interactions, and that means being human and empathic with others with a genuine expression of concern and support. So not just sympathy, but empathy. Relationships, we value and seek to develop secure and dependable relationships characterized by mutual respect and attunement. Relationships are critical, but they require some vulnerability. And communication, we promote dependability and create trust by communicating in ways that are clear, inclusive, and useful to others. But what does this look like in action? For you individually, treat yourself with kindness, support, and understanding. Self-compassion here is critical. Here's the thing. Nobody does better when they're berated or told that they need to get better, they need to do this, right? We do better when we are in our cognitive brain. The second we're attacked, we move into our emotional brain, which is how none of us grow and change. But the reality is, so many of us, when we do something we don't think is right, we beat ourselves up. We talk to us like we would never talk to a trusted friend. All that does is keep us in our emotional brain. It keeps us from being able to show up the way that we want to. So self-compassion, there's a link at the end to Kristen Neff and her work on self-compassion. I highly recommend that you check that out. Also increase your capacity to be dependable by being optimistic about what's achievable while being realistic about challenges. At the organizational level, cross-trained staff have succession plans from when there's staffing shortages. One of the things we did at our organization is we literally had leaders go through everything that they do and talk about who could pick that up if something happened, right? Maintain consistency in practice and policy when changes are needed to make sure staff and clients have been provided with adequate notice. We can't just spring things on them. We have to give them time and do it in multiple different ways. Safety and stability. So again, we see this theme of safety. Core competencies, stability, we minimize unnecessary changes. And when changes are necessary, we provide sufficient notice and preparation. Physically, we create physically safe environments that are accessible, clean, comfortable, visually welcoming and appealing. And social environmental, we maintain healthy interpersonal boundaries. I could do a whole training on boundaries. This is how important boundaries are to this work. And we manage conflict appropriately in our relationships with others, right? So we're ready to show up and be direct, but compassionate. Principles in action, individual. Here's one of the things that when we think about boundaries, think about a professional boundary that you can improve. Are you checking your emails all weekend and you don't really have to, but you feel like you have to? What is that a boundary that you need to look at? Is there another boundary that you might need to look at? And make a commitment to really think about how you can maybe firm up that boundary a little bit for your own self-protection. Or you can schedule, another thing is scheduling meetings and events with 30-minute cushions. One of the things we realized is that in Outlook, you could set it up so that meetings could be defaulted to 50 minutes, or 30-minute meetings can be defaulted to 25 minutes. You can actually set that up in your Outlook. And that gives you that 5-minute buffer. Don't always use it. Sometimes you might end up taking the full hour, for example, but oh my gosh, that 5 or 10-minute buffer can be really, really helpful. At an organizational level, have transparent decision-making rules for meetings, projects, and products. Do environmental scans on a regular basis to identify the needed repairs and cleanliness. That comes to that real organizational, like, do we feel like we're safe here? Are the locks working? Are the lights working? What happens is security, do they come in and out at a normal pace, right? So what are the things that we can do? Have family members participate in walkthroughs, be on a safety committee, post results. So there's some guidance in one of the resources that has been shared with you. Another core competency is collaboration and empowerment. So empowerment, we recognize the value of personal agency and understand how it supports recovery and overall wellness. Preparation, we proactively provide information and support the development of skills that are necessary for the effective empowerment of others. And opportunities, we regularly offer others opportunities to make decisions and choices. So that comes back to that voice and choice that we talked about. In action, build connection, learn about the work of your colleagues, teams, departments, understand your stress responses and those on your team. Let them know what you need when you are feeling distressed. Organizationally, create opportunities for participatory decision-making, where staff from different levels of the organization can contribute in strategic and operational decisions as appropriate. Have a common policy and procedure folder available for everyone. And then there's cultural humility and responsiveness, the core competencies, differences. We demonstrate knowledge of how specific social and cultural groups may experience, react to, and recover from trauma differently. Humility, we understand we don't know it all. We're always learning about the differences between social and cultural groups, and we are responsive. So we have and can easily access support and resources for sensitively meeting the unique social and cultural needs of others. Some of these principles in action: regularly reflect on the ways your own cultural, social, and racial identity informs your thinking and acting. Increase your knowledge of implicit and structural bias, oppression, racial equality, and racial justice by going to trainings, reading and research. You can do the implicit bias survey at Harvard. Organizationally, value diversity and practice inclusive behaviors. Include a variety of people from different backgrounds to participate in organizational evaluations, planning, decision-making, and hiring. Make it the norm to ask who is missing from the table. Finally, resilience and recovery. Core competency is path. We recognize the value of instilling hope by seeking to develop a clear path towards wellness. Strengths, we proactively identify and apply strengths to promote wellness and growth. And practices we are aware of and have access to effective treatment skills and personal practices that support resilience and recovery. What does this look like? Individually, looking at your own wellness practices and acknowledge and highlight practices that have sustained you and others. Organizationally, provide a culture of learning, appreciation, and celebration. Acknowledge the effects of secondary trauma, and create mini retreats, wellness resources, or other kind of organizational strategies that we've talked about. So next steps, think about how these apply to your agency. What are the areas that your agency does well? What are some things that might need to improve? And maybe create an elevator speech, a couple bullets as to why your agency should become more trauma informed. Share these with your team and leadership. So here are some resources that I pulled from today. You can also, in your participant guide, page 15 has these listed out, as well as the videos and all the links. But this is really where a lot of the content came from that I talked about today. So at this point, I'm going to end this slideshow and open it up for questions. I see that we have about 5 minutes. So are there any tips, resources to help neurodivergent individuals who are generally more sensitive, prone to traumatic stress? Many neurodivergent individuals I have talked to say they experience hyperempathy and find it impossible to turn off. What a great question. I actually think a lot of what we talked about today, while we're talking in broad strokes, it really does need to be individually. So some of that hyperempathy might be not being able to separate as much. So thinking about what are some more practical cognitive strategies that they can do. Because part of what happens in hyperempathy, I might actually argue that that's the emotional part of the brain responding, and that maybe helping move to the cognitive, maybe in more very specific, clear tasks, well communicated, presented in a lot of different ways, can actually help move to more of that cognitive part of the brain. But really, everything that we're talking about today, while we're talking in broad strokes, really has to be individualized based on the folks that you're working with. But I do think when we're talking about folks who are neurodivergent, there's a whole spectrum. And so really thinking about having a conversation with them about what might work based on this idea of the different parts of the brain and how we access that and what the hope and expectation is, and really tailoring it to meet the needs of your specific individuals. Okay, so looks like we have maybe 2 more minutes. If there's another question that folks want to drop in the chat, we can address that.
There's a question about the participant guide. We will drop that back in the chat. Also to let participants know that the resources that we discussed today, the recording as well, will be sent in a 2-day email.
It looks like, let's see, it looks like maybe there's one other. How would you address racism in the organization? I think that there's a lot of racial trauma is real and it needs to be addressed at the organizational level. I would say that's a very, very big question, but really getting some specific support in this area. There's some great consultants and folks that do the work specifically on racial trauma. There is a resource I would, maybe we can include this in what we're sending out as well, but the National Child Traumatic Stress Network really developed this kind of anti-racism essential to trauma-informed care. And it's a whole bunch of guidance on what organizations can do to address race and trauma and kind of at a lot of different levels. So we'll make sure to include a link. It's a free resource. I would definitely invite you to check that out. Looks like Haley put that in your chat. So it's a fantastic resource. Great people work together to put it together. So I think that would be a great place to start.
Great. Those are all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat and in the Q&A feature. So for those of you that are here as participants, Obviously, if we were in a room together, we would all clap, but since we're in a virtual space, the best way to do that is to use your reaction at the bottom of the screen. So if you use a reaction, this is our kind of virtual applause. And of course, we want to say, Dr. Conradi, thank you so much for being with us again. We're so grateful for the information you provided. Thank you to the participants with the questions and your participation today. What we're going to do now is we're going to start dropping a link to your survey in the chat. That survey is going to give you a couple of things. Number one, everyone will receive a certificate of attendance at the end of the survey. And if you are an LCSW, LPCC, LMFT, or LEP, there's a section at the end of the survey where you can request CEUs. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance. All right. So for everybody on the call, we just want to say thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.